All right, well, let's get started, everyone. Hello, and welcome to 1 year in InCommon's Future. So thanks so much for joining today's IAM Online. This is our monthly webinar focused on identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet2. My name is Jean Horszewski. I am the director of InCommon Academy, and I am today's host. Steve, you're driving our slides today. Next slide, please. We're going to do some introductions today of our speakers, and they're going to spend a little time telling you all about what's going on with InCommon, and we will have time for Q&A before we close today. So next slide, please. 2, probably. Just as a reminder, we are taking questions, so as you're listening in, please feel free to offer your questions and comments, but try to use the Zoom Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen and send your messages there, and we'll try to get to them for sure by the end of this conversation and webinar, but we might take a few here and there along the way as well. Also, please feel free to post your messages in chat. Just make sure that you select the little drop down that says chat with everybody so that everybody else sees your messages. Those of you interested in seeing this later, we are recording, so you will receive a link to this recording via email, and it will also be posted on the InCommon website and in our IAM Online YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that as well. All right, well, next 2 slides, please. All right, well, now for some introductions, everyone. So today's webinar, March 2024 marked a really important moment for InCommon when it took a pivotal step forward in its Futures2 strategy and really charting a course to become the research and education community's trusted authority for identity and access management. And gosh, here we are in 2025, we are approaching the 1-year milestone. And so much exciting progress has been made, from new tools to practical toolkits and more. So I am so happy to introduce today's speakers and leaders of InCommon who are going to tell us a lot more about that. So today we have Kevin Morooney, Vice President of Trust and Identity and NetPlus Services, Ann West, Associate Vice President of Trust and Identity, and Steve Zoppi, Associate Vice President, Services and Integration and Architecture. And we also have a special guest, Chris Misra, Vice Chancellor for Information Technology and CIO from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he's also our chair of InCommon's Steering Committee. So these are the speakers that you'll hear from today, and Kevin, Steve, Ann, I will turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jean, and welcome everybody. So in preparing for today's IAM Online, you never know who's going to show up. And I looked at our title and it said, "Welcome to InCommon's Future." And it didn't necessarily frighten me so much as it's like, well, who are these characters who think they know what the future is? Next slide, please. So some of you may be thinking after you saw the title that it's rather showy for us to think that we can talk about InCommon's future. Next slide. Or perhaps you might fancy us as a despot who can talk about InCommon's future. Next slide, please. Or perhaps a charlatan. We're trying to sell you something that might not be the future, but that we pretend to be the future. And next slide, please. Or perhaps you might think that we think we're magicians of some sort and can act on some magic and tell you all the future. But that is not the case. We come from a very different place, and I want to take another minute or two to try to describe where it is we come from in talking about the future. So next slide, please. So after you all survived the New Year's Eve 1999 and Y2K, not too long after that, InCommon was born. We celebrated InCommon's birthday last year. Last year was a milestone of InCommon's 20th year. In 2009, InCommon, Internet2 leadership, and prominent community leaders published something called the InCommon Futures Report. And just last year, we published something, as Jean had mentioned in her comments, the InCommon Futures2 Report. Next slide, please. So between 2004 and 2009, before the Futures Report was created, and that roadmap was created, InCommon got started, right? It overcame the inertia of not existing to existing and then getting into motion. And the uptake was notable if you look at it from a 5-year perspective. But the impact of the futures report was considerable. Going to the next slide, please. Not too long after the InCommon Futures report in 2009, the Federation grew by one metric, the number of organizations that connected to it, in significant ways. Next slide, please. InCommon also connected itself to the emerging worlds federations, of which there are approximately 80 now. In 2004, there were about 0. 2009, there were a handful, and now we find ourselves with scores and scores of federations with thousands of services and thousands of identity providers. Next slide, please. And to me, maybe not to you, but what takes my breath away is the existence and the vibrance of all these things, all these activities, all these services, if you will, that have been created in that period after the InCommon Futures report 15 years ago in 2009. Next slide, please. Just 2 years ago or so, in the first Internet 2 event, after the pandemic, it was kind of a rolling after. Internet 2 held a leadership exchange, and our then chair of the InCommon Steering Committee, Mark Wallman, who's the CIO and Vice President of IT at North Dakota State University, grabbed me at one of the coffee breaks and did what any good chair would do, and pushed me a bit to say, hey, Internet 2 is talking about road mapping and futures discussions. Maybe we should do that too with InCommon. And I made Mark aware of the futures report in 2009 and the impact that it had. And by the time Mark and I left Denver, we decided that we would take this notion of doing a new futures report back to the committee. Mark did that. After about a year of conversation, we kicked off a project called the Futures2 project, because it's the second time we've done this. And then about a year after that, we put ourselves in a position to publish that Futures2 report, which, similar to the 2009 report, was not just a creation of ours, those of us who work at InCommon and Internet 2, but many, scores and scores of people in the community, our community leaders, contributed to that document. Next slide, please. So we come to you from a place of not being showy or somehow trying to pull the wool over your eyes or thinking that it's some form of magic, but rather, next slide. It was really about 20 years of hard work, choices, and persistence made by 3-digit numbers of people over that 20-year period. Next slide, please. You all worked extremely hard in those first 20 years. We know, over the 2-year period of knowing that we needed to have this report and creating that report, we know we're going to have to lean on hard work, making tough choices, and being persistent in our intentions and motivations and accomplishments. That's why we come to you, and you're going to hear this from Ann and Steve. This is why we come to you saying, we think we're in a position to talk about the future because of all the hard work y'all have done, and that we know that we're going to do over the next several years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ann and Steve.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And thanks for the intro. So you all have, I think, a good sense of where this strategic work that we're 1 year in working on has come from. I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of primer on what InCommon is, who we are, and then go into some strategic pieces that we're working on as part of that report. So InCommon, for those of you who are unaware of who we are essentially the trust and identity arm of Internet 2. So we provide community-tailored IAM tools and solutions, strategic guidance for unique privacy, trust, and security needs of the U.S. research and higher education community, empowering secure, scalable, interorganizational collaboration and resource access. So that's a big mouthful. And so let's get into a little bit of brass tacks. Next slide. So we run primarily two federations, and they enable access to wireless, roaming, global access to wireless. Folks know that as EduRoam, and we also run InCommon Federation, which is more around access to services. As Kevin has mentioned, InCommon Federation has grown enormously, as well as EduRoam even in the last 5 years. So taken together, they provide two community access frameworks for research and education. Next slide. But we also have tools and people to help with this inter-organizational collaboration and resource sharing. So we develop open source software called the Trusted Access Platform, and it can manage organizational identity and access management information, as well as research and virtual organization identity and access management for access to distributed services. It works for, as I mentioned, research service providers, as well as SaaS providers, so corporate industry providers, if that's of interest. And it all connects in with the InCommon Federation. So it's an end-to-end organizational framework to enable access from those with the end users to do single sign-on, as well as with those providing the services that need to protect the risk. We also provide a security layer that underscores all of this, the InCommon Certificate Service. We have professional development and training, which Jean leads for the InCommon Academy. And we have trusted corporate support providers under the guise of InCommon Catalysts. And they are primarily corporate, although not all are corporate partners that provide integration services, hosted solutions, and essentially IAM guidance for those who are looking to get boots on the ground help. And underlying or kind of the part of the engine of all of this is a community innovation cycle and engagement. We have community advisory groups. We meet, over 50 people meet bi-weekly and another 13 monthly to make this all go, make the decisions, and drive the bus. Next slide. So as part of the Futures2 work, we wanted to kind of do some things that are a little bit out of the ordinary to kind of develop and address specific community challenges. So instead of focusing on essentially a technology, we focus on what's a business problem or an academic mission problem that organizations are facing. So the first one that we looked at was essentially course sharing. And this is under essentially to support the drop in enrollment that a number of universities, colleges and universities are seeing. It's a well-documented phenomenon. I think there's also cost issues in addition to shrinking enrollment. So how do colleges and universities essentially enrich their catalog without incurring a huge amount of cost and essentially gather and be more attractive to more students? So we partnered with an alliance in the center of the country, IDEA, the Interactive Distance Education Alliance, and they are a consortium of about 20 institutions. They've also been working together for about 20 years, and they offer two common academic programs across these 20 institutions. The interesting thing is they've had concerns from their students over the years around managing multiple credentials. I think about several years ago, the consortium got together and kind of worked with the various institutions to say, what are the options for addressing this? And InCommon rose to the top as being a really viable option. And so they approached us. We agreed to work with them and have been over the last probably 9 months engaging various stakeholders across the IDEA Alliance on what are the concerns, what are the challenges with implementing single sign-on across these learning management systems. How can it benefit students? How does it benefit faculty? And so on. It's been a fascinating kind of time to engage all these various stakeholders, in addition to working with IT on the specific technology needs. So next slide. We have the first kind of the final report finished, and we'll be talking more about that at Community Exchange later on this year, and the outcomes from it. But basically, the overall goal is to develop a toolkit for organizations looking to share courses and needing help with handling the access management pieces for this incredibly valuable mission enhancement. So if you take a look, and hopefully you can read these, I think in an actual face-to-face presentation, this may not work, but hopefully on your Zoom screen, you'll be able to look at this. But part of the work that we did is engaging IT and the learning management system owners around things like multi-factor and what are the needs for multi-factor. And so you'll see that on the left side, upper left side, 60% of the respondents, and again, this is a small group. This is about 10 organizations from IDEA that filled out this survey. But many of them are starting from the IT perspective, understanding that course sharing is super important. Multi-factor is also really important in the institutions. And then, of course, starting to layer on multi-factor across learning management systems is really important. Doing that on a case-by-case basis for an individual, for students without an access framework like InCommon would be really, really difficult. We're happy to help with them with that. Next slide. So another part of this, and this gives you an idea of kind of the various folks that we worked with to understand what the concerns were. We put together sort of the challenges for each of these various stakeholders, and we'll be looking at sort of pieces and toolkits and communications for each of these particular community members, so that, for instance, IT can be a hero, right? When they're talking about or hearing about sharing courses, you'll be able to pull in essentially these particular pieces for your stakeholders. Or if there's a dean that connects with another dean at another institution, they'll be able to do the same. So the idea is multiple stakeholders will be able to use this toolkit, make sense of it, and hopefully help their academic mission and the student access. Next slide. So the second piece that we're looking at, community challenge, is really compliance. So for those of you who are aware, National Institutes of Health required multi-factor access for the use of their grants management system, ERA, and NSF recently did the same. I believe it was in October 11th, they released a Dear Colleague letter requiring researchers to layer on multi-factor onto their NSF credentials, enabling by October 27th. So gave them roughly 2 weeks to do that. Lots of reasons for that to happen. Luckily, we had already been working with NSF for access to research.gov, and this was specifically for research.gov. So we had a conversation with them about how InCommon could help, and the net effect was that for those schools that were integrated using InCommon to research.gov, their home credentials for those researchers didn't need to change before or after the deadline. So it was just a really lovely kind of connection, partnership with NSF, but then also an outcome for the researchers at the schools that leveraged InCommon for access to research.gov. Next slide. So in this particular case, we're working with National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health to sort of now align their needs for access management, security, for access to their grants management systems and other systems that they are looking to have published in InCommon. By the way, NIH publishes behind their gateway. They don't even know how many how many resources that are published behind there, but hundreds was the word that was used when we asked. So they are very much looking to leverage InCommon to reduce their costs and up their security. So one of the things NSF, for instance, is looking for is phishing resistant MFA. So that's one of the kind of the key pieces that InCommon will be engaging the community around. Definition, what are the requirements there? We have a group under the Community Trust and Assurance Board that's looking at campus changes to infrastructure for identity assurance and MFA to enable access to these valuable NIH and NSF resources. So this is a slide essentially that presents a value proposition to the federal agencies, working with them. And then we're also working with the Community Trust Insurance Board, as I mentioned, part of InCommon's advisory groups to develop specific campus recommendations for how to achieve and address these standards. Next slide. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to Steve, who'll tell us, how we're going to work on achieving these things.
Thanks, Anne,
Steve.
and welcome everyone. I just wanted to mention that reflecting on the litany of different enhancements that the infrastructure of the Federation has undergone over the last 10 years is phenomenal. And we look at the complexity that it now has as a part of just providing access, not just for research institutions, but for the enterprise components of our community members, institutions, and then their interfederation needs. Operationalizing this relies very, very heavily on having different qualities of data. So it's communications, knowledge, and data acquisition, curation, and management are the cornerstones of being able to pull all this stuff together. So if we look at sort of the architectural view of this, how we acquire information about the use of not just the Federation and the services, but also how the tooling that the community has built for itself is used within its own confines and also interinstitutional operations is very important for us, because we don't want to build things that for the sake of building things. We want to build things that have great use and complement the offerings that are already emerging in a very rich commercial ecosystem that you are all painfully aware of some days and some pleasantly aware of on others. So when we look at the kinds of things that we do as a part of the community, we need better insights and relevant statistics, not just about the community writ large, but also how you're using tools and how you're using the things, the services that we build with and for you in context. And so to quote Peter Drucker, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that is the reality of the world that we're in right now. Now, 10 years down the line from where we started, a lot of these things pre-tier, trust and identity and education and research, there are a lot more features and functions and interdependencies that we have to be able to enable in order to get things like the addition of eduroam to the portfolio certificates, the network itself to function in the way that you as community members need them to function. So part of that gives us better knowledge, better information. How are we doing? What kinds of training do we need to do with and for you? What kinds of services do we need to be able to provide to connect you all together, to share your practices around security and identity management? And identity and access management, if we think about it in its true light, it really is the formation of an interdisciplinary guild. There are skills that have to be shared with each other, and that's really difficult because it's tradecraft. There are practitioners who are more skilled in some things than others. There are new skills that are being acquired along the way. The community's population, if we look at just the results of participation in TechX alone, it was our largest bolus of participants that are first timers in the identity community ever. So there's a lot here that we can share with each other. And so providing the connective tissue between all of the participants and practitioners in the community is the only real answer to helping our community thrive in this ecosystem. So when we look at the kinds of things that we also have to add to the portfolio, even though it's intuitive to identity practitioners, and it has been for a long time, that security and trust and identity are very closely related and overlapping and intersecting in so many different ways. The security community has largely looked at itself as being apart from the identity community in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways. And so where we're starting to see this need for greater outreach and interdisciplinary connectivity is in compliance and audit, secure course sharing, as Anne mentioned, the IDEA consortium, scalability of services, leveraging of uniform authentication and authorization. These kinds of practices are extremely important as we start getting into development of hybrid solutions that are both offered by commercial offerings like Okta, et cetera, and the password managers and all these other various tools that have to somehow converge on how we manage our collective infrastructure. So the best way that we can help facilitate the Futures2 work is to continue to gather better information about how best to connect all of you together with each other, how to provide the kinds of training that are gaps in the commercial offerings today. And there are a considerable number of gaps that we observe and we hear about all the time, because most of the enterprise solutions or most of the commercial solutions are very enterprise focused, and they tend to not understand or speak to the needs of interfederated higher education, research and education communities writ large. And so those kinds of disciplines, those kinds of skills, those architectures are really important for us to be able to share with each other in order to be successful in the future. So Anne,
Thanks,
do you want to, summarize up for us?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so this is just kind of a real light skimming over what we're focusing on this year. I think there's going to be a fair amount of, there will be a fair amount of report out at the Community Exchange, as well as further discussion around this. One of the key things that we haven't really talked about in this presentation, for instance, is the innovation cycle. So one of the things that InCommon is really has been part of our history, as Kevin mentioned, and as Steve is talking about, is the innovation cycle around what is the community need in the identity space in the next five or so years. And so there are groups, the Community Architecture Committee for Trust and Identity, CACTI, for instance, is kicking off a working group around OpenID Federation. And so things like looking forward, figuring out where we need to go, understanding the business requirements that organizations have, not only higher education, but the partners too. So federal agencies, industry, and corporate SaaS providers, as well as government agencies. So it's a very interesting and complex community that we're in, and looking to figure out how we move forward in this is really a large part of what the Futures2 work is about. So if you want to hear more about these toolkits, again, we'll be working on and coming up with the specifics about what's in the toolkit for the course sharing. We have our first essentially discovery and definition project. We'll be talking more about that, as well as federal agencies, working with the federal agencies, and what organizations, campuses can do to essentially enable their faculty, staff, and students to access federal services through InCommon. I think, as Steve said, which is a huge thing, is all the new people at TechX. We have this wonderful opportunity to engage these folks into joining the community and providing a professional development track for them to be able to contribute back at their organizations, but also give back to the community at writ large. And it's super important. Another piece about this is will be, and I think Jean is working on this, a lot of introductory things to help these new people understand, and new folks in identity and access management roles understand who we are, what to do, and then providing information about identity and access management planning tools. For those of you who are at TechX, we previewed a tool called the Sketcher tool, which enables organizations to kind of, in a graphical kind of predefined way, identify what their architectures look like and be able to share those across with others. And so there's a lot going on underneath the covers that we haven't even talked about that we'll be chatting about at Community Exchange and connecting with you about. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Kevin to
Great,
monitor.
thanks, Ann.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Ann. No questions have come in yet, so I'd like to encourage you all to fire up your curiosity in the next couple of minutes, because you've got plenty of time for questions. Got about 15 minutes for questions. But as you think about questions that you might have, I wanted to invite Chris Miser into the conversation. Chris has been a member of this community for a very long time, and he now also holds the position of Chief Information Officer and Vice President of Information Technology at UMass Amherst. And Chris has spent time in the security community. He spent time in the identity and access management community in higher education, and now serves as the chair of InCommon's steering. So Chris has a rich set of perspectives, and now as chair of steering has a super relevant set of perspectives. And I just wanted to invite Chris into the conversation to share a little bit about what is on his mind relating to the future of InCommon. Chris.
Great. Thanks, Kevin, so much. And thanks. I see a lot of names in the participants that I know. So hi to those of you who I know, those who I don't. Again, I'm Chris Miser. I'm the CIO at UMass Amherst. I don't think I have the unique distinction, but I think I'm one of the few CIOs in our higher education community who also had to install Shibboleth once upon a time in their career. So I'm hoping to see that metric increase, specifically those of us on the CIO who actually know what it's like to install Shibboleth. And granted, my experience is a decade old at this point. But the reason I raise that is I've been very fortunate and privileged to get a lot of support within this community through Internet2, through InCommon and like, that helped me in my career. And I've come in and out of identity space, and it's just interesting to be in this role now. So a couple things I'll say. I feel like back in the day when I was doing IAM a long time ago, I was shouting into the void about this thing that really, really matters, is really, really important, and we really better do it right. And I think I generally got the, you know, we have lots of problems. From my CIO seat now, roll the clock forward, you know, a decade. We, like many schools, are having our profound navel-gazing moments about all things ERP. What do we do? Geez, it's a lot of money. Hey, we've got to do it. And we're talking about the standard suite of, oh, we have HR and finance and student. And my pushback to the teams looking at this, and we're looking at it as a system, is, and what is the common element to all of those? Like, you got to log into it. So we really better get that right. So identity has really been an element of substrate, which is key. But what's interesting is it's actually viewed as core infrastructure, not just that thing that there's some folks that do that we get really mad when it doesn't work. The other thing I'll say is, you know, from my CIO seat, the core platforms for me now are LMS, email, data sharing. Again, all of those share this commonality of identity as the core component of it. So I've really been working with my team to rebuild and focusing on identity as substrate. It's core to everything we do as a campus to be successful from an institution, from a mission. And, you know, InCommon's been a great partner for us in that. From the sort of scary side, you know, when I start looking at, man, identity is core to so many of these things, this opens up identity as attack surface. So we better do it right. We better follow common architectural principles. We better understand our data. What are the inflows? What are the outflows? I'm so pleased with the Sketcher work that's coming out of the Internet2 folks to help us really assess this, because this has been done in very small bespoke communities and really needs to be part of that documented infrastructure. The last couple of things I'll say is, again, we are still a proud user of Shibboleth, And I am thrilled to say we are a proud user of Shibboleth through one of our Catalyst partners. And that means nobody on my staff is installing it anymore. And that from a CIO seat is great. One thing I've really been pleased to see is we've worked with a number of the Catalyst partners, the ecosystem developing around this community to support it. We had a great engagement with Cirrus Identity. Deirdre and her team were fantastic, and they're running our Shibboleth platform for us, and I couldn't be happier. It's been a great experience. And that's a very different lens from where I was 10 years ago installing software, versus paying a partner to do that work for us. And the last thing I'll say is there's a number of partners, we've worked with Unicon in the past, we've worked with Morooney, we've worked with Cirrus. There is an ecosystem out there that I think doesn't get enough credit for supporting, especially if you're coming from a smaller community, a community that doesn't have the resources to support it internally. Engage with them. I found them to be great partners. Many of them come from this community and understand the community in a profound way. I will close with, as much as we're not doing the course sharing thing that Ann had talked about previously, we exist in a number of consortiums. We're part of a system. We are also part of a 5-college consortium with a number of small liberal arts colleges. A decade ago, we did a Shibboleth training, and it took a while for it to pay dividends for us, but we deployed Eduroam across all of colleges in the consortium. We have some degree of shared platforms. We're really looking at this because we're facing the same pressures. And I'm fully convinced that the investments we made a decade ago are really helping to remove the barriers that allow things like this to happen. So I could see things like course sharing in our future. I could see other shared platforms in our future. But a lot of these are long payoffs. And that's okay. As a community, we have that objectivity in higher education to do it. We're not chasing a directed bottom line. We may go into conflicted and difficult times, but that's where we're at. And with that, Kevin, I see a couple of questions, though my reading skills and talking skills at the same time are not good. It's like chewing and walking and chewing gum at the same time. So I don't know if somebody wants to try that question there.
Yeah, I was going to invite the combinations of me and Steve, Joseph Sharman, I think at Colorado College, about an hour south of Ann. So there might be an opportunity for coffee-oriented answer to your questions. One of Joe's questions is about the InCommon certificate service and the emerging and urgent need for automation. And then a question about possible integration between Midpoint and Grouper. So I'll start on the certificate service, invite Ann and Steve to maybe contribute to that, and maybe Western Colorado. Okay, I was close. Well, I mean, I was at least in the right rectangle in the Southwest. So yes, the needs of those who are responsible for certificate management on campuses is not lost on us. We recently re-established our relationship with Sectigo, who's the sort of the back-end provider of our certificate service. Sectigo is certainly doing things to help with automation, as are other providers of similar ilk. I don't have a specific answer to your question. We just this is right in our crosshairs for the future of that particular service. Ann or Steve, did you have anything else you might want to say about the future of the cert service as it relates to automation?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's definitely a concerning thing on our list as well. Couple things we're looking at, Joseph. One is essentially pulling out the best practices that other schools are using to do this, and highlighting those in webinars and basically case studies. The second thing is we've had an internal discussion, but we'll, I think, likely pursue this, and that is to engage the catalysts around who can help with those organizations that are interested in getting more boots on the ground assistance for doing this migration. So we do have ACME as part of the certificate service, and that's likely the way that we would recommend you do that. But doesn't mean that it's not a challenge, and so getting some help could be, for those who are interested in getting that, probably is something that we'll be working on and announcing here soon.
Just one quick comment. We're well aware of the fact that the certificate providers writ large, all of them, are moving as quickly as they can to enhance and enrich their administrative front ends. And Anne mentioned Acme as being one of the key features that they have to be able to implement reliably. And so we're well aware of the fact that it's not just Sectigo as our underlying provider, but all certificate providers that mint anything that we have to rely upon have the same challenges. And so keeping up is a little bit of an iterative process as far as the certificate providers definitely have to keep up with the CA browser forum rules prescribe, but everybody knows that everyone can only move so fast. And so there is a little bit of a hurry and wait in this process. And that's why I think that being able to be more precise about dates and times and features is difficult, but we are all well aware of what the market dynamic is and what the requirements are as they move forward. So the Catalyst partners, as Anne mentioned, are super important to this. And they will, there will be more that, I can only offer stay tuned to our communications, because as new information and new approaches arise, we discuss them actively in Slack channels. We discuss them in email, various working groups, various implementation groups, Grouper, Midpoint, Co-Manage, Shibboleth, communications forums, all talk about these things. So dial into those channels and you'll probably get the most current information.
Steve, did you want to slide into the midpoint grouper question?
Yeah, I
as
was
well?
just going to do that. And I'll combine this. So the question is there a plan to integrate midpoint and grouper? The answer is no. They do very, very different things in terms of a platform. But as far as some of their functionality goes, to do better integration between them, I believe is what you're pointing at. I would say yes. And if the conversations that we have in not just the component architecture meetings, but also in the Slack channels are any indication, they're actively listening to each other for opportunities and better means of doing integration. And it's not just between midpoint and grouper in terms of complementary functionality and complementary interfacing, but it's also across all the other products too. So we have Co-Manage in the fray, and there are also discussions about how to best integrate with commercial offerings. So as far as the integration, taking sort of two different views, integration as becoming one product, not necessarily. Do we architect them as one product? Not necessarily. But as we approach how to best create more functional touch points between the products, absolutely, we are working as a community to build better interfacing, and it's not just between these two products. So I hope that answers your question, and feel free to re-up any clarifications that you need in the channel, and I'll do my best to try and untangle that.
I will add a little bit of, it's not necessarily color, I don't think, but Steve mentioned the component architects group, and Anne in her presentation time mentions the 50 to 75, depending upon you count, people that people in the community, not employees, that come together in the community to guide us in a variety of dimensions. Steve and his team manage something called the component architects group, and twice a month, the lead developers and curators and stewards of what we call the Trusted Access Platform convene and discuss these kinds of questions. So there is a regular heartbeat, if you will, of connecting these kinds of ideas and these kinds of needs to one another. And as Steve said, there are Slack channels, there's other tools, there's other collisions in a positive way that take place outside of those meetings. But we do try to increase the likelihood that these kinds of ideas and needs would be addressed. So with that, I want to see if Chris or Anne or Steve have a parting shot. I do not.
A parting shot, I don't know that I have one. I'm going to decorate some of the things that were mentioned earlier by Anne and Chris. The thing that Anne mentioned, the System Sketcher tool that we are building with a third-party agency, is intended to give a little bit of color, because it came up in a private message to me here, it's a tool that's intended to help illustrate the complex relationships between various identity system solution components. So that, and one of the bigger problems that we've had as a community is the community has sought for a very long time, and the component architects declared the idea of having a perfect outcome dead a couple of years ago. And that idea was, can we have 5 or so patterns, or some finite number of patterns that all of us can model our systems and services against, that would be sort of blessed by the community. And in looking at and decomposing all the various use cases, we concluded that that was impossible to do for all the reasons that you probably already know. But we did conclude that having a common visual language was a really important part of not just expressing information and our answers to these questions to each other, but also to others in our institutions with whom we work and we're trying to convince to make the right kinds of investments. And so to facilitate those dialogues better, the System Sketcher tool is a visual language homogenization or canonicalization, if you want to think of it that way, that enables an architect to put on virtual paper the ideas that are in their head, visualize them, illustrate them, and help others understand the complexity of what is otherwise an extraordinarily abstract set of concepts. Identity and access management is really painful in this regard. So I'll say that all of those ideas for how we're approaching this came from the community. And so we tried really hard to answer the first question, which was just give us a handful of answers that we can go, blueprints that we can go work with. And instead, through multiple iterations with all of the inputs that we've gotten from all of you and all of the extended community, this is where we have arrived. And so thanks to everybody, and we look forward to getting your feedback as this rolls out.
Great, thanks for that addition, Steve. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jean to close us out. Jean?
Well, many, many thanks, Kevin and Steve and Chris. Gosh, lots of exciting things that got elevated today, and so much for all of you to be staying tuned for and with. Thanks to all of you too who have attended today, and we very much appreciate your listening in and tuning in. Before we sign off, you heard today we've been talking a lot about community exchange. So this is the place. Internet 2 convenes the global R&E community to exchange ideas, to leverage shared knowledge, but also to build these collaborations and to ask questions. And as Anne mentioned, we're going to be revealing even more of the things that got brought up today at this event. So if you haven't yet registered, you can now. Registration is open, so visit the Internet 2 website under events. Once you get the slide deck, you